Hello and welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Please don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe. Today we take a look at one of the most notorious Yardi gangsters to ever exist in the UK criminal underworld. Known as one of the UK's most dangerous prisoners, this man still strikes fear into anyone who crosses him to this day. Today we take a look into the infamous story of Gary Lloyd Nelson, a man who opened fire at a van driver who drove too close to him and shot another man during an argument at a nightclub, was sentenced to 8 years in jail at the Old Bailey. Gary Lloyd Nelson, who was 26 at the time and working as a security guard, was found guilty of possessing a firearm with intent to endanger life and of possessing a firearm in a public place. Builder Gary Keywell said that in September 1993 he had been driving behind Mr Nelson in South London. He grew impatient as he followed Mr Nelson's BMW, which had slowed down at every junction. The pair had exchanged obscene gestures to one another, but the builder became nervous when he saw a girl in the passenger seat of Mr Nelson's car reach into the footwell and hand him something. Mr Keywell said, "I thought it was getting a bit silly, so I decided to turn right." Then Mr Nelson leaned out the window and pointed his right arm at me. I heard a cracking noise and I ducked down behind the dashboard. I felt the thuds of bullets hitting the van. From the rate of fire, I would have said it was an automatic weapon, said Mr Keywell. Mr Keywell added, "I was very shaken." The court heard how earlier another man escaped injury when Mr Nelson allegedly shot him in a nightclub, but the bullet hit the zip of the pouch he was wearing around his neck and very luckily ricocheted off. William Boyce, who was prosecuting, told the court that in June 1993, Mr Nelson had fired shot at Mohammed Massaquoi in the street after an argument over a woman. The pair next met at the SW1 club, where Mr Nelson walked up to him and said, "Remember me? I'm the guy who was buzzing shots at you," before pulling a pistol from his waistband and opening fire, hitting me in the legs, thighs and buttock. Mr Massaquoi had gained evidence at Mr Nelson's trial, but was in custody awaiting trial himself on another charge of attempted murder. He was found dead in the prison soon after. Judge Dennison said the cause of death was not yet known, but it was likely to be suicide. Nearly 2 years ago, Mr Nelson was accused of another man of plotting to murder an alleged drug dealer, William Danso. The charges were discontinued early in the proceedings. It was while on the way to investigate Mr Danso's death that PC Patrick Dunn was shot dead in Clapham in October 1993. The jury took 4 hours to reach its verdict in the Old Bailey, sitting at Southwark Crown Court. As Mr Nelson was sentenced, he winked at supporters who were packing the public gallery. The police forces were put on high alert as one of Britain's most dangerous men was freed from jail. The decision to release suspected cop killer Mike Tyson Nelson midway through a sentence in which he has terrorised warders and inmates alike has shocked officers who were spearheading the battle against a Yardi crime wave in the UK. A senior detective said, "Sentencing is a joke when one of Britain's worst criminals gets 8 years and is out in 4. Where is the logic in that? It's not as if he's been reformed." It was only after Radio 1 DJ Tim Westwood was shot that the true extent of the Yardi-related crime in London had become apparent. Detectives were, at that point, investigating the 14th Yardi-related killing in the last 7 months. Another 30 people had been wounded in that time also. And now, the 29-year-old Mr Nelson is one of the group's top gangsters. National newspapers had obtained a leaked copy of all the forces bulletin about him. It tells how he was originally arrested for the murders of PC Patrick Dunn and William Danso, who were shot dead in Clapham. He was accused of Mr Danso's killing, although charges were later dropped. The murder at this point had still remained unsolved. The bulletin continues. He was also found not guilty of attempted murder of 2 North London police officers and of 2 further attempted murders, which is believed to be of drug related. His custodial behaviour has been consistently disruptive and he is suspected of involvement in the prison drug scene and bullying. He has also assaulted and made serious threats against staff. The heavily scarred Mr Nelson went to Jamaica after the 1993 shooting of PC Dunn, a community bobby, but he returned and he was jailed for opening fire on a van with an automatic pistol. The police are worried that he will get together with his Yardi pals. A senior officer said, "He hasn't changed. He's threatening to get hold of guns again." Mr Nelson is a grave danger to the public and the police. Scotland Yard is determined to find and cut off his supplier. Detectives are working around the clock hunting the Yardi's underworld armourer. Forensic tests on seized weapons ranging from pistols to Uzi submachine guns bear the hallmarks of conversions made by the same expert. It was, at the time, 10 years since Jamaican criminal gangs had began flooding Britain with crack cocaine and their trigger-happy gun culture. It was at this point at least 7 years since Scotland Yard was made fully aware of the deadly prospect of a Yardi crime wave hitting the UK. Detective Chief Superintendent Roy Clark, who is now a commander, made the chilling prediction as he flew back from a fact-finding mission to Jamaica and devised tactics to stop a bloody gang warfare on Britain's streets. He wrote in his report in July 6th of 1993, "Our strategy must be long-term if we are to prevent the Jamaican gangs infiltrating and taking a permanent hold in London and spreading elsewhere." Sadly, his master plan is all but in ruins. In the months that followed, Scotland Yard faced unprecedented criticism about the anti-Yardi tactics that Commander Roy Clark first sketched out. The Police Complaints Authority will decide who should be punished for the disastrous use of Yardi supergrasses who raped, robbed and murdered whilst on the police payroll. The PCA action follows the scathing report by Hampshire Chief Constable Sir John Hoddingnut. It is understood that only junior officers are facing disciplinary charges, while the bosses who supervise them escape unscathed. The report made by Sir Hoddingnut's team revealed inquiries had unearthed a can of worms on Scotland Yard. Detectives and immigration officers now fear they will be made scapegoats in a Stephen Lawrence-style whitewash operation. They claim senior officers wanted them to fail because of the political sensitivity of targeting black criminals in racial hotspots like Brixton. In a statement which had been leaked, one officer said, "I was told, you've got a nice thing going for you. Trips abroad, conferences, hire cars, just don't rock the boat." It became clear to me that our unit had been formed as a knee-jerk reaction to the spat of murders and shootings. Lines had been drawn, and I had upset the senior officers by failing to play the game. It became apparent that those tasked with halting Yardi-related crimes were at this point understandably confused how best to tackle the job. It seemed so easy when Commander Roy Clark penned his battle plan and advised, "The Yardis do not conform to our image of organised criminals. They relish enhancing their reputation by public displays of violence, use or possession of firearms, and the involvement of drug dealing. They like people to know the detail of their criminal act, even if they are murders that they have committed. But therein lies the key. They are capable of being brought down by the aggressive use and radical use of informants and information." When he wrote that memo, Commander Roy Clark could call on an experienced band of officers who were aware of the horrifying potential of using ruthless gangsters as informants. But disturbingly, a young constable became vital to the success or failure of the operation. PC Steve Barker, nicknamed John Wayne because of his height and swaggering walk, was pounding the beat in Brixton when he persuaded a leading Yardi to become his informant. Suddenly, he was catapulted to the front line of the Yardi war, often finding himself helping several high-risk operations at once. It would have been a hard burden for a seasoned detective, let alone a beat Bobby. At that time, Dalroy Epsy Denton was a top informant of the Yardi underworld. Senior detectives found it impossible to ignore his value as a double agent. One officer told Sir John's team, "I was impressed by Mr Denton's knowledge of Jamaican criminals, both in Jamaica and in the UK. From intelligence reports received by PC Barker, I'd no doubt he had committed serious offences of violence in Jamaica, but he now appeared to be an isolated figure attending a bricklaying course at college, with little money but keen to make extra as an informant. I discussed my findings with my line manager, and I was given the authority to recruit him." Mr Denton had taken advantage of our weak immigration laws. It would have been unprofessional and morally wrong not to have taken advantage of this situation and use him as an informant in order to arrest persons of more danger to the public than himself. Unfortunately, Mr Denton's recruitment carried a heavy price tag. Disaster struck when he was arrested and charged with having an inappropriate relationship with a 15-year-old schoolgirl. The case was dropped, then another bombshell dropped. In a frenzied attack, Mr Denton, who was at this time 38, stabbed the woman to death, slashing her throat 18 times. Scotland Yard's #1 informant was described in court as a sex-fueled psychopath. More soul-searching followed, with the news that Eaton Green, another Yardi informant, had helped to rob 150 party guests in Nottingham at gunpoint. After his trial, it emerged that he was a serial killer who had confessed to 12 murders in Jamaica. To find out more about Mr Green, give our History of Nottingham series a watch, where we take an in-depth look into organised crime in Nottingham. Meanwhile, one of the Met's most successful Yardi hunters was forced into early retirement. Now, former Superintendent John Jones sits at home deeply worried about the Yardi explosion. He says of the rookie cop PC Barker, "I hope he doesn't become the fall guy for all of this. He was working really hard for at least 3 different police squads. He is not to blame for the mess. I don't think that nowadays there is the know-how or the experience at the top. Officers are wary of getting involved in black crime because of the racial overtones. There is a lot of pussyfooting attitude today. Things went horribly wrong, but middle management should take responsibility. Unfortunately, it's the junior ranks who take the risk and the blame." Described in court as a psychopathic killer who strode away laughing moments after shooting dead a man who disrespected him and a police officer who came to the scene by chance, was jailed for 35 years. 12 years after the brutal double murder was committed. Gary Nelson, who was at the time 36, and was dubbed one of Britain's most dangerous gangsters, was found guilty of the murders of security guard William Kwame Danso and PC Patrick Dunn in Cato Road in Clapham, South London in October 1993. Mr Nelson, whose police sources believe is responsible for more murders, is already serving life after police found his Hitman kit in 2003. He refused to leave his cell in Belmarsh Prison in South East London to hear the verdicts at Woolwich Crown Court next door, sentencing him to life. Mr Justice Wilkie recommended he serve at least 35 years. PC Dunn's brother, Steve Dunn, a former pastor, and Gifty van der Puy, Mr Danzo's sister, said they forgave Mr Nelson for his actions. But another of the policeman's brothers, Ivan Dunn, said outside the court he, referring to Mr Nelson, loved the gun and lived by the gun, but he did not have the moral courage to face us when he was being sentenced. I do not forgive him for what he has done, and I never will. Detective Chief Inspector Steve Richardson, who led the investigation, said, "He is undoubtedly one of the most dangerous men in the country, and it is to be hoped that he is never released." Infatuated with guns, Mr Nelson called his Browning 9mm semi-automatic pistol "my special thing." With a violent record stretching back to his early teens and links to one of London's most infamous crime families, he accumulated a fortune which he spent on a luxury apartment, top-of-the-range cars and designer clothes. He was a hitman, but he was so much more than that, a Scotland Yard source said. Hitmen are at the bottom of the criminal food chain, taking orders. Mr Nelson was at the very top, giving them out. He killed whoever he wanted, or he arranged to have them killed. Nicknamed Tyson, he shares the US boxer's physique and trigger hairline temper. Under the new rules admitting bad character evidence, the jury was allowed to hear details of his previous convictions, including the occasion on which he opened fire on a man who overtook his car. The incident epitomizes the extreme fatality of a man who carried out the Cato Road shootings just 7 weeks later. Mr Nelson, who was then 24, killed Ghanaian-born Mr Danso because the bouncer refused him entry to a nightclub, and then intervened in a row involving a friend of Mr Nelson's at a mobile phone shop, where Mr Danso also worked as a security guard. That night, Mr Nelson and 2 others, armed with a Browning 9mm semi-automatic and an Italian-made Tanfoglio self-loading pistol, went to Mr Danso's flat in Cato Road and mowed down the father of 4 in a hail of bullets. By coincidence, PC Dunn, who was 44, a former maths teacher who had joined the police 4 years previously, arrived on his bicycle to deal with a minor domestic dispute at a house opposite. Hearing gunfire, PC Dunn, who was dubbed Dixon of Dock Green for his friendly manner, rushed into the street, and Mr Nelson, who was carrying the Tanfoglio, fired a single shot into his chest, killing him instantly. Witnesses heard the trio laugh and fire a celebratory shot into the air as they walked to a waiting car. Mr Nelson was charged with the murders 5 weeks later, but the case was dropped due to lack of evidence. His aunt, Rose Nelson, led a group of women in a bizarre middle-of-the-night expedition to retrieve the guns buried in Wandsworth Cemetery, near where he lived at the time, but they could not find the guns. However, 5 months later, police dug them up, guided by an anonymous phone call by one of the women and lipstick crosses on the grave. There was still not enough evidence to charge Mr Nelson, who was soon back in jail for the road rage incident, but he continued to inspire fear in all he knew, especially from his prison cell. In 1994, Mr. Nelson ran naked from his cell, lunging at prison officers with a broom handle. He once managed to break free from a straitjacket and intimidated some of the country's most hardened criminals into handing over phone credits so he could ring his many girlfriends. Released from jail in 1999, Mr. Nelson was soon back in the South London criminal underworld. In January 2003, in an investigation not connected to Cato Road, police bugged his apartment in Woolwich, South East London, and heard him racking his gun. Officers burst in to find a Browning 9mm, complete with a laser sight and a silencer. He was subsequently sentenced to life for possession of firearms. The police were amazed to see 30 pairs of trainers, all arranged on the bedroom floor, with exactly the same distance between each pair, while in the wardrobe hung rows of designer suits, coordinated shirts and ties. The Cato Road case was reopened in 2001, partly because of pressure from the Dunn family, and a BBC Crime Watch appeal brought forward from former fellow inmate in Wormwood Scrubs, who testified that Mr. Nelson told him in 1994, "I shot that copper, the one on the bike." Sandra Francis, the woman whose Christian faith prompted her to alert the police about the guns, was also traced and agreed to give evidence. Detectives travelled to Ghana and tracked down Eugene Dejaba, the manager of the shop where Mr. Danso worked. Mr. Dejaba had fled after jumping bail in 1996 and was convicted in his absence of a £3 million cigarette fraud. In a highly unusual move, he testified via video link about seeing Mr. Nelson pull a gun, which he later identified as the Tanfoglio, from his jacket the day before the murders, and threatened to put a bullet in the belly of another man. There is no definitive forensic evidence, and Mr. Nelson was never picked out in an identity parade. But Richard Horwell QC, prosecuting, built his case on 13 planks of circumstantial evidence, which he argued placed Mr. Nelson in Cato Road and the Tanfoglio in his hand. DCI Richardson described Mr. Nelson's attitude during the police interviews as nonchalant, but as Mr. Horwell told the jury, arrogance and notions of invincibility sometimes go before a fall. DCI Richardson said the gangster, who considered himself invincible, was finally brought to justice. It had been recently reported that the notorious gangster jailed for life for killing a community policeman could be responsible for up to 4 more murders, it was claimed. Gary Nelson, who was nicknamed Tyson, shot a local police officer, Patrick Dunn, in Clapham in 1993. Mr. Dunn, who was 44, had been investigating a domestic assault when he confronted Mr. Nelson moments after the career criminal had killed a nightclub bouncer, William Danso, a father of 4, in a dispute at a house nearby. Mr. Nelson, described by police at the time as the most dangerous man in London, was finally jailed in 2006 after the new investigation. Richard Horwell QC, prosecuting at Woolwich Crown Court, said Mr. Nelson had made a dramatic prison confession to PC Dunn's murder, and he gave the jury the gun which allegedly killed PC Dunn for them to examine. Mr. Horwell said that Mr. Nelson was associated with this weapon, a 9mm Italian-made Tanfoglio automatic pistol. One of the guns fired at Mr. Danso. The other was a 9mm Browning pistol. Both guns were found 7 months after the murder, buried in a cemetery near where Mr. Nelson then lived with his mother in Wandsworth, and her fingerprints were on one of the plastic bags that the Tanfoglio was wrapped in. Firearms residue of the type produced by the murder weapons was also found on Mr. Nelson's clothes. Mr. Horwell said that although Mr. Nelson had never been picked out at an identity parade, a series of compelling evidential links placed him at the scene in Clapham that night and placed the murder weapon in his hands. He said several witnesses would testify that one of the gunmen opened fire on PC Dunn as they came out of Mr. Danso's flat, and all 3 had laughed loudly as they fled. The first case against Mr. Nelson collapsed in February 1994, but the current situation was very different, said Mr. Horwell. Mr. Nelson had previously argued with Mr. Danso, who had refused him entry to Brixham Academy, where Mr. Danso was a doorman, and Mr. Nelson's close friend, Tony Francis, had been involved in a row with Mr. Danso at the top shop where he worked as a security guard just hours before he was murdered. The prosecutor said that recent changes in the law allowed the jury to hear evidence of his bad character, including how he'd fired shots at another driver in a road rage incident a month before the 1993 murders, and of firearms and violence convictions in the years 1985 to 1990 and in 2003. He said that Budgie Stokes, Mr Nelson's cellmate in Wormwood Scrubs in 1994, would testify that Mr Nelson told him, "I shot the copper, the one on the bike." Mr Stokes, an ex-soldier, has waived his right to any reward for the capture of PC Dunne's murderer. A former Met officer who was involved in the original inquiry told of his personal battle to snare the South London gangster and said he believed the criminal was behind as many as 3 to 4 more killings. Mike Tyson, now an author of Rural Crime in North Yorkshire, details the activities of Mr Nelson in a book of his experience of the young Bobby on the beat in the Winstanley estate in Battersea in the 80s. In Crime Squad, Life and Death on London's Front Line, he described how the gangster's rise was fulfilled by the rise of crack cocaine in London. He writes in the book, "He was the most dangerous man in London. He had taken on the mantle left by the Yardis. Mr Nelson was king, and to be king, you had to terrorise, so no one would doubt the lengths to which you were prepared to go." Mr Tyson told the local newspaper, "I have no doubt Gary Nelson was responsible for more killings, but no one would speak. He had a hold over the community. I would say he was responsible for 3 to 4 other murders." Mr Tyson described how detectives found guns used in PC Dunne's murder buried in Wandsworth Cemetery after an informant signposted away with lipstick crosses on a tombstone. Mr Tyson joined the Met aged 23 in 1988 and was posted to Battersea, then top of the city's crime league tables. He says, "It was a tough place. I was there when crack cocaine was just taking over. I could see people becoming more violent. I'm appalled to see gun and knife crime is still high in London. But we were also seeing a huge shift in crime online and gang culture is as strong as ever." Scotland Yard had helped the snitch get a light sentence, despite suspecting him of supplying the guns used to murder one of their own officers and a security guard. Gangland informant Brimore Lindop was arrested with enough firearms to equip a small army by detectives probing the shooting of PC Patrick Dunne and civilian William Danso, who was 31. It was revealed that Mr Lindop was sentenced to just 2 years after his Metropolitan Police handler briefed the trial judge that he was a valued snout. The handler had run Mr Lindop for 4 years by then. As a result of the findings, Mr Danso's family has called for the Met Police Commissioner, Cressida Dick, to launch a full independent public inquiry. PC Dunne, who was 44, a mature recruit to the Met, was attending a domestic incident in Clapham, South London on his bicycle when he heard gunshots across the street on October 20th, 1993. Gary Nelson, then 23, had shot Mr Danso on his doorstep and was fleeing with 2 other men when he shot PC Dunne in his chest and left him to die. Witnesses reportedly heard Mr Nelson laughing as he fled from the brutal killings, causing a shockwave across Britain. Officers discovered that Mr Lindop had worked with the retired police dog handler to supply weapons used by Mr Nelson, but never pursued the investigation. Instead, he faced 2 separate charges of possessing a huge cache of guns and ammo, which earned him 2 years in jail. Mr Lindop told one source that he'd feared a lengthy sentence. Mr Danso's family said, "We are deeply distressed to hear the evidence that suggests that a corrupt retired Metropolitan Police officer and a police informant supplied the guns used to murder our father. Our family calls on Dame Cressida Dick to refer this matter to the Independent Office for Police Conduct for independent investigation with full support and cooperation from the MPS, and to account to us and the public as to whether there has been an institutional cover-up." Retired Met Detective Sergeant Steve Morris, who confirmed Mr Lindop's link to the PC Dunne murder weapons, echoed the family's sentiment. He said, "I find it repugnant that Mr Lindop was never brought to justice for supplying weapons that killed PC Dunne and Mr Danso. What message does this send to those risking it all on the front line of policing? The only way to resolve this very serious issue is to have a full independent public inquiry with teeth into the actions of the Metropolitan Police." Mr Morris said it was an open secret that Mr Lindop was supplying guns, but police took no action. PC Dunne was a former maths teacher who had retrained just 4 years before he was shot dead. As well as hearing Mr Nelson laughing, witnesses reported seeing him firing shots into the air in apparent triumph after the killings. The hitman, who was named Tyson after the US boxer, was arrested weeks later. In November 1993, Richard Watts, who was 34, was charged with 2 murders. Mr Nelson and Anthony Francis, 28, were accused of conspiracy to murder Mr Danso. The charges were dropped due to lack of evidence in February 1994, though justice would eventually catch up to Mr Nelson. Around the same time, a Browning semi-automatic pistol and an Italian-made Tanfoglio self-loading pistol used in the attack were discovered at Wandsworth Cemetery close to Mr Nelson's home. Detectives claimed they had received an anonymous tip-off from a woman and were guided to a stash by lipstick crosses on gravestones. Separately, Finchley Flying Squad was working on Operation Carla, a probe into the guns. Officers raided Mr Lindop's yard in Dagenham, East London in March 1994. Mr Lindop and his friend, a former police driver, Norman Fellows, later pleaded guilty at the Old Bailey to possession of 10 illegal firearms. But according to court documents, the pair were caught with far more. Mr Fallows, who was 51, also feared a long sentence, but was jailed for just 15 months despite possessing assault rifles, telescopic sight and silencers, as well as 44 boxes of ammo. He also took detectives to 3 Smith & Wesson revolvers and a semi-automatic pistol hidden in a stream in Hainault County Park, East London. Mr Lindop, then 46, had a loaded handgun in his pocket when he was arrested. At home were 11 assault rifles, 3 revolvers, 3 shotguns, 3 pistols and 3,451 rounds of ammunition. He also had telescopic sight, silencers and body armour, all the favoured tools of a hitman. But when jailing Mr Lindop and Mr Fallows, after being briefed by police, Judge Neil Dennison said neither of the men had intended to supply criminals. Mr Lindop had been recruited by the Regional Crime Squad and had earned fortunes providing information on organised crime, his police handler revealed. Documents revealed by sources showed how Mr Lindop, a former doorman and convicted armed robber, was authorised by top brass at Scotland Yard take part in police stings against drug gangs in London and Liverpool. 4 months after arresting Mr Lindop in July 1994, the Flying Squad raided the 3-bedroom home of former police dog handler Sidney Wink in Ilford, East London. His tea was still warm, but there was no sign of Mr Wink when police arrived at 5:30 am. He had shot himself in the head down an alleyway 2 days later, shortly before he was due to be quizzed. Police believe Mr Wink was a part of the racket where illegal firearms were rendered useless and then legally registered before being reactivated and sold on the black market by Mr Lindop through a third man. His house was full of deactivated and reactivated firearms. It was an arsenal, said a senior Flying Squad detective. Mr Wink, who was 66, had been selling weapons for 18 years after retiring from the Met in 1975, following 25 years of service. A police spokesman denied reports in 1994 that he had supplied the guns used to kill PC Dunn, but reporters had it confirmed that he was involved by 5 sources, including 3 former officers. One said it was known Mr Wink had converted the Tanfoglio used by Mr Nelson because of its distinctive markings made by a tool he used to remove serial numbers. The source said there was a mechanical fit between the punch removed from Mr Wink's workshop and the gun. Mr Wink was reportedly suspected of reactivating at least 270 guns, of which 150 made it into the hands of criminals. He left a suicide note for his wife, which stated, "I am very sorry for what I have done." Mr Lindop was murdered outside his home in Goodmays, East London, 8 years later, aged 55. He had been getting out of his black M-Reg Range Rover Discovery when he was shot 4 times, including in the head and mouth in January 2002. At the time, the unsolved murder was one of 7 allegedly tainted by police corruption. Mr Nelson was finally jailed in 2006 for a minimum of 35 years for murdering PC Dunn and Mr Danso. Mr Watts got 10 years for a separate firearms offence. A Scotland Yard spokesman said no complaint had ever been received in respect to this matter. A Supergrass who helped get the policeman's killer jailed is suing Scotland Yard after he was denied £80,000 in reward cash. The informant told how Mr Nelson made a prison cell confession in Wormwood Scrubs in West London while serving time for another offence. Now, according to legal papers at Leeds County Court, the Supergrass is suing the Metropolitan Police for £80,000 plus interest of 8% a day from January 1st, 2011 to January 1st, 2012, totalling £4,277.32. The wit as interest continues to acquire at a daily rate of £18.47, which so far adds up to a further £8,700. The Jamaican-born gangster Mr Nelson, who wore £50,000 worth of bling, drove luxury cars, lived in posh apartments, was believed to be behind a lot of violence in the city. Mr Nelson, who had so many enemies he slept in body armour, was charged with the murder, but police could not nail him, so he roamed free for more than a decade. In 2001, the case was reopened after advances in mobile phone tracking, which showed Mr Nelson at the scene of the crime in Clapham, South London. BBC's Crime Watch made an appeal that year, and the Supergrass came forward. Mr Nelson was arrested 5 weeks later, and the jury heard he'd screamed at a custody sergeant, "I'll cop it," like the other one fucking copped it. Mr Horwell told the jury criminal proceedings were dropped against Mr Nelson 3 months earlier because of insufficient evidence, but he had been in prison for a separate offence in 1994. He allegedly told another inmate, identified as Budgie Stoke, he had a £100,000 reward on his head, the same reward which was being offered for the killers of PC Dunn and Mr Danso. Mr Nelson was said to have told Mr Stokes, a convicted thief, "I shot the copper, the one on the bike." Since being incarcerated, there has been many stories told about Gary Nelson. One that has become the most infamous is a story where he was a minder for Mike Tyson when he came to London for his fight. When Mike Tyson came to London to fight Lou Savary sometime in the year 2000, Mr Nelson was his minder and running partner. Mike Tyson had specifically asked for him after hearing about his reputation, which was similar to Mike's when he was growing up. A story circulated that Frank Warren was assaulted by Mike Tyson when he came over for that fight. Mr Nelson had made Mike Tyson get him some expensive jewellery as a thanks for him guarding him during a previous fight with Julius Francis earlier that same year in Manchester. It was reported that he was quite forceful with Mike, grabbing him by the throat and screaming at him. So Mike went into the shop with Frank Warren and took the jewellery, believing that Frank would pay for it. But Frank Warren had no intention of paying for it, as he felt that what had happened was between Mike Tyson and Mr Nelson. After agreeing to produce Tyson's blockbuster fights in the UK, Mr Warren admits he should not have got involved with the notorious fighter, who set himself on the course for disaster following a trip to the jewellery store. This was a time in Mike Tyson's life where things were unravelling at a frantic pace. Following shortly after, he served a prison sentence and infamously bit Evander Holyfield's ear. It was my fault what happened, in as much as I shouldn't have got involved with Mike Tyson business, Mr Warren began. The first time he came over to England, there was no problems. He was great. Then he went into a jeweller's and I came out of an invoice for about £2 million. He never paid the bill, and quite rightly, the jewellers wanted to get paid. They kept ringing me, and I kept ringing the States, and they're telling me, "Don't worry, we'll sort it. Let's do another fight, and we'll pay it out of that." So I'm passing this information back on. But when he came back the second time, he was just awful, beyond awful. He was very aggressive, and a totally different scenario. The bill still hadn't been paid, and still he had gone into the jewellers. Being the man responsible for Mike Tyson's stay in the UK, Frank Warren took it upon himself to go and address the situation, but maintains he had not been given the full picture as to why the heavyweight was so furious. I got a call from someone who said Mike's not happy, so I got to the hotel and it's all meetings. I stand there talking, and the next thing, he's took a swing at me, and he's actually caught me. So there was a big commotion in the room. There was a lot of people in there, and I didn't expect it, to be honest. I wasn't prepared for it. It was a cheap shot. I got up and it was all pandemonium. It was crazy. He was a lunatic, but it all ended. I was absolutely fuming. The lawyer from Showtime wanted to call the police, but I said no. He owed Showtime, Mike Tyson, around $20 million allegedly. All the newspapers had said that my jaw was broken, my ribs were broken, but that was bullshit. I had a burst vessel in my eye and that was it. So when Mike Tyson came back for the Louis Saversi fight, the jewelry shop said they were going to sue him, and he flipped out and attacked Mr Warren in the hotel room. Mr Nelson got to keep all the jewelry. Thank you for joining us today. What are your opinions on the crimes committed by Gary Nelson? Do you believe there was enough circumstantial evidence to convict him of the murder? Also, what are your opinions of his run-in with Mike Tyson? Please let us know what you think in the comments below. Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this content, please don't forget to like and share. And if you're new to the channel and want to see more Street Crime UK content, hit subscribe and press that bell so you can join us on the next video. Thank you for joining us, and until next time, stay safe.